In this video, we'll be looking at how to complete an analysed cashbook and post to the general ledger. This is a comprehensive video that you can use as a study guide. You may need to pause it a few times, and I aim to explain this in as much detail as I can to enable you to successfully complete a cashbook question with confidence. The question we'll be looking at in this video is from the 2019 Junior Cycle business paper. In this question, you're given some financial information about Food to Go Limited, and you must put these entries into an Analysed Cashbook and post them to the general ledger. We'll read over the question in a few minutes, but we'll start this video by looking at a cashbook. You can see here what one looks like. It can seem quite daunting, but really once we begin to break it down and take it section by section, it's really not that difficult. An Analysed Cashbook is like a detailed financial diary for your business, keeping track of all the money coming in and going out. The cashbook serves a couple of purposes, but the main are it keeps track of all transactions. Just like you'd note down every time you spend or receive money in a personal diary, the Analysed Cashbook records every single financial transaction for the business. There's two main sides. There's a debit side and a credit side. These sides are used to record where the money is going. Is it going into the business or is it going out of the business? Depending on where the money is going, depends on what side you put that transaction on. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next section. It has categories for easy tracking. Imagine if you had a wallet and you had different sections in that wallet for paying for your lunch, paying for your bus, getting your wages. The cashbook is similar to this, where every transaction has an account. Why would we use a cashbook? Well, it keeps everything organised. We can see if we have accounts for everything like wages, sales, expenses, etc. You can easily keep track of all of these, and at the end of the period you can see how much you're spending in each category. It is easy to generate reports such as posting to the general ledger, which we'll be doing in part 2, or if you're working for a business and had to create a report or easily see how much you're spending on wages in a given month, it makes looking for these figures a lot easier. And it helps with budgeting. You can see where your money is coming from and where your money is going out to. Anything that's important that I'm talking about will be highlighted on screen, just so you can bear that in mind going forward for the video. So here we have our cashbook, which looks something like this. It has a debit and a credit side. So we got to figure out what to put on each side. The easiest way to remember this is when we receive money, be that capital, a loan, we get a grant, or we make sales, you put this into the left hand side of the cashbook. Again, that's money into your business, goes on the debit side, which is the left hand side. Whereas when you spend money or money goes out of your business, it goes on the credit side, which is the right hand side. Examples of money out would be paying for employee wages, paying for electricity, paying for supplies. Now we know that money in goes on the left and money out goes on the right. We can see that there are certain categories listed in the cashbook for each account or transaction. Like I explained in the last section, this is where you can easily see how much money you spent on each area. So if you spend 50,000 on wages in 1 month, you can easily see it in the cashbook. Now that we have a good idea of the function of the cashbook, we'll start with the question. So this question is for Food to Go Limited, is a fast food retailer which operates in 10 locations in Dublin. Complete the Analysed Cashbook of Food to Go Limited for the month of May from the information provided below and balance the account. There's quite a bit of information given to us here, but we'll just break it down step by step. I've highlighted the first one, which was on the 1st of May, where shareholders invested 21,500 in the company. We'll jump back to our cashbook now and make note of this transaction. Always ask yourself before you put in any transaction details, is this money in or money out? Shareholders invested in the company, so it is of course money in. In other words, we receive this money from shareholders, so it's going on the debit side. We'll start at the top here and begin by adding in our date and some details about it. Again, it's capital investment, so we can just put capital into the box. Now we'll cast our eye over to the remaining columns until we see a capital column. And this is where we'll insert the 21,500. This just means we are making note that the 21,500 we received was for investment. So we would have received 21,500, and where would we have received the 21,500 into? Of course, it would be our bank account. So we must look for the bank column and add in our 21,500. By having a look at the transaction now so far, we can see that it's matching. 21,500 was added to the bank and essentially allocated towards investment. With that inserted, that's the first transaction recorded, and we'll just highlight that in green to indicate that it's done, and you can do this in your test or give it a tick so you don't get anything confused or make a double entry. Next up, we have sold goods, which is on the 4th of May for 12,000 plus VAT at 13.5%. Now again, ask yourself, is this money in or money out? We sold goods, so of course that's sales, which we received the money for, and in that case it'll go on the debit side of the cash book. Follow the same method here, insert the date and some details about it. We'll just say sales. Next, have a glance over and look for a sales column. Once we see this, we'll put in our 12,000 euro. This isn't done here, it involves an extra step where we have to calculate the VAT, which we've seen in the last section is 13.5% of 12,000 euro. So you can do this in whatever method you prefer, but all you have to do here is simply find out what 13.5% is of 6,000 euro, which works out at 1,620. This is the amount of VAT we received on sales. So we'll have a look at the cash book for a VAT column, and it's in here that we put the 1,620 euro. The final step now is to add up our sales and VAT. We're adding these up because this is the final price the customer would have paid us for the goods. So this is the amount that we must put into their bank column. This adds up to 13,620, which again goes into the bank column. To give a bit more context to that, say if you're selling computers and sold a bunch of them to a tech company for 12,000 euro plus 13.5% VAT, you aren't expected to just receive 12,000 euro from the tech company. You also want to receive the VAT on top of that. So this is why we received 13,620. The VAT is included in the total figure in the bank, as this is the total that was paid to us. You just have to separate them in the cash book so you can easily track how much VAT you received or how much VAT you paid if it was on the credit side. Now that we're done with that, we're on to our wages that were paid on the 6th of May for 3,000 euro. Back to the cash book, we just ask ourselves, was that money in or money out? We paid those wages, so that is money out, which goes on the credit side of the cash book, which is on the right hand side. We follow the same method here, insert the date and details. Next, we'll have a look over for a wage column where you put in that amount, which is 3,000 euro. So again, that's just noting where the 3,000 euro was allocated for. We also must make note of where it came from, and it would have came from our bank account. So we add the same amount to our bank account. And again, at a glance here, you can see that we paid 3,000 euro out from our bank account. And what did it go towards? It went towards wages. It's matching the 3,000 and the 3,000, which means we're on the right track. So every transaction that leaves your bank account needs to go towards something. Next, we see we purchased goods for resale on the 15th for 5,600 euro plus VAT of 13.5%. We purchased them, which means we bought them, so that means that's money going out of our business, and that will go onto the credit side of the cash book or the right hand side. Same thing again here, insert the date and details and have a look over for the purchase column. Insert our amount of 5,600 euro, and again, like on the previous transaction that included VAT, we must find out what 13.5% is. So calculate 13.5% of 5,600 euro, which leaves us with 765 euro. We're going to put that into our VAT column. We add these two figures together and put them into their bank column, which is 6,356 euro. This is the total amount we paid for the goods. To break that down a little, if we owned a coffee shop and had to buy 50,000 coffee cups, and the price was 5,600 euro plus VAT at 13.5%, the final price wouldn't be 5,600 euro. We must also pay the VAT on top of that. So that is why the total we paid in this case is 6,356 euro. Next up, on the 23rd of May, we paid electricity, which was 670 euro. So ask yourself, was this money into our business or out of our business? We paid it, so it's money out, which goes onto the credit side. Insert the date, some details, and look for an electricity column. Insert our amount of 670 euro here, and then make note of 670 euro in the bank column, because we would have used the bank account to pay that. Finally, we're nearly there, and on the 27th of May, we paid wages of 2,850 euro. I know we already made note of wages before. We don't go and edit those figures, we make a new section. This just streamlines things and makes it far easier to see what we spent and when we spent it. So we go and insert our date and add some details about it, wages. We look over for the wages column, insert the amount of 2,850 euro. Now we've made note of where the money was allocated. We go back to our bank account and state that amount we spent on wages, which was 2,800 euro. And again, Here we can see in the bank column, we spent €2,850. And what did we spend it on? We trace our eyes over and we see the wages column of €2,850. So that's all our transactions taken care of. It's not that bad once you break it down into money in and money out. You can't go wrong once you know the basic rules. So our next step now is to balance the books. So first step here is to add up all the columns you see highlighted in the video. This is just adding up all of your accounts that you signed the money towards. Once you've done this, you enter the amounts below a few columns or boxes down. Just allow a bit of space above these amounts and you'll see why in a minute. With these amounts done, our next step now is to add up our bank account. So we're adding up everything we received and everything we spent. We see from our debit side adds up to €35,120. This is all the money we received for this month. And our credit side amounts to €12,876, and this is the money we spent this month. This is a good healthy set of accounts for a company. Just make note of these figures first, don't write them in any boxes yet. I've mine highlighted in green here. You can write them off the side of your page, or what I like to do is just add them above the bank column so I know what belongs where. So again, total on the debit side, the left hand side, is 35,120. Total on the credit side, the right side, is €12,876. The goal here is to make our books balance, so the totals on both sides should be the same. What we're going to do here is add in the bigger amount into both sides like I have highlighted here. So far, all you're doing is adding up the two bank columns, make a note, and adding the largest of the figures into both sides of the cash book. We can see now our cash book is starting to balance with the same figure on each side. But we still have another step to do. What we need to do now is get our balance carried down and our balance brought down. Our balance carried down is the amount of money left over at the end of a period that will be carried forward or brought down to the next period. To find this, we look at our figures again. We took in €35,120 in money in May and spent €12,876 in May. Now our balance carried down is what is remaining in the month. Essentially what we have left. Simply take €12,876, what we spent, away from €35,120, what we received, which leaves us with a carried down balance of €22,244. And this is our balance carried down. This is placed on the right hand side, the credit side, because this is the side that had the lowest of the two figures. So if you're to add up all the figures in the bank column now, they would amount to 35,120. They didn't a minute ago until you added in the balance carried down. So the balance carried down is essentially filling in that gap to ensure that the books balance. Now our balance carried down, which is again what we have left over after all our expenses were paid, becomes our balance brought down to the next month. So we're going into June with this figure of €22,244. So this will again now swap sides and come down to the debit side, as this is our starting cash available for the next period. In other words, what we're going to be starting June with. So with that done, that's how we complete the cash book element of the question. I'm very aware there's a lot to take in with this question, but if you can remember the basics here, that money that goes into the business goes on the debit side, or the left hand side, and money that goes out of the business goes on the credit side, which is the right hand side, then you'll be in a good position to answer this question. Always just ask yourself before you write in any transactions, are you paying this money out or are you receiving it? And that will dictate what side of the cash book it goes, and you'll be perfectly fine once you remember those steps. The next step of the question now is posting to the general ledger. And the general ledger is like the master record of all financial accounts of the business. It summarizes all financial activities and accounts like sales, expenses, assets. All of these have their own separate account in the general ledger. Whereas the cash book was like a record of everything on the one page, general ledger has separate accounts for each transaction. It's similar to the cash book in certain ways, such as having a debit and a credit side, but any entry that you had in the cash book will be posted to the opposite side in the general ledger. This is the simplest way to navigate this section. We can get into it further here, trying to figure out which side is debit and which side is the credit, but the easiest and most straightforward way is to swap them about. The way I remembered this in school was to think of the question like a football match. The cash book was the first half and the general ledger was the second half. They swap sides at half time. So whatever analogy you can think of to help you remember it won't do you any harm. So to recap, let's just say you own an ice cream shop. You sell €5,000 worth of ice cream in a month, and you want to make a record of this transaction in both the cash book and the general ledger. In the cash book, we go back to basics and ask ourselves if it's money in or money out. You sold the items and received cash, so it's money in. Money in goes onto the debit side of the cash book, which is on the left hand side. Now, at the end of the month, and we're going to be posting this transaction to our general ledger, it simply swaps sides. It's now going into the credit side of the general ledger. So any entry on the debit side in the cash book now goes into the credit side of the ledger and vice versa. To take a quick glance at the ledger, there isn't a lot to it. Use space to put in a date, details, and a total. There's a debit and a credit side and a space for you to write which account you're working with. To make things easier, I'll put the cash book up on screen so as we can see what figures we have to post to the ledger. So we'll start with the VAT account, which will be the trickiest of the whole lot, but if you follow these steps, it isn't too bad. So we'll enter our name and then have a look at the cash book to see our VAT accounts. And we have two. The debit VAT account, which is when we sold goods. We received a percentage of VAT on those goods. And on the credit side, when we purchased goods, we were subject to a percentage of VAT on the purchase price. So we'll start with our VAT amount of 1,620 on the debit side. Again, what I said here is anything in the cash book swaps sides when it goes to the ledger. So it was a debit in the cash book, now it swaps to the credit side. So just like is shown here, the figure goes down to the total column, and we'll just make note of the details and the date. It's important to put the date here as the last day in the month, as we were asked in the question originally to complete the ledger for the month of May. So hypothetically, we're doing this on the last day of May. So this is the date that we'll be putting in. Next, same process for our VAT on purchases. It was a credit entry in the cash book. Now it becomes a debit entry in the ledger. So I'll take our figure of €756 and post it down to the ledger, just like we see here. And again, enter our details and date. So now, since we have a debit and a credit entry into our ledger, we need to balance the ledger. We're going to follow the exact same method we used in the cash book to balance the account. We're going to take the larger of the two figures we took down, which is €1,620, and put this into both sides. Now we need to find the balance carried down, which is the difference in the two sides. So we're going to do this by getting our larger figure of 1,620 and subtracting our smaller figure of €756 to find our difference, which is €864. So this goes on to the debit side. So now when you look at the debit side and add these two up, it adds to €1,620, just like the credit side. In other words, our books are becoming balanced. Now take this balance carried down and bring it to the opposite side where it becomes our balance brought down to the next month, which will be the 1st of June. Now this is what a completed ledger account looks like. You can see the larger figure of €1,620 on both sides, which helps us balance it. Then all you have to do here is find the difference between our two figures, and this becomes our balance carried down. With our VAT done, we'll move on to our capital account. We'll look in our cash book to see where capital is and what its total is. So capital is investment, so it's money received, so it's on our debit side. Using the half-time analogy, we swap sides and our capital entry in our ledger will now be on our credit side. We'll start with writing in our total of 21,500 and add in some details and a date. And remember, the date is the last day in the month, and it's as simple as that. That's our capital account posted to the ledger. We'll move on to our purchases next. We'll write in our name and go back to the cash book to see where our purchases are. Purchases are items bought, so it's money spent, which is money out of our account, so that's why it's on the credit side of the cash book. Same rule, we'll swap sides. This now becomes a debit entry in the cash book. So again, we'll write in the amount of €5,600, our details and our date. Next, we'll move on to creating our electricity ledger. We'll start by writing in our name, and we see on the cash book that electricity is on the credit side, meaning it's money we spent. Now again, we'll swap sides, so now it becomes a debit entry in the ledger. Add in our total, details and a date, and that's our electricity ledger closed. After this, we'll move on to our wages ledger. In the cash book, wages is an expense. It's money spent, and that's why it's on the credit side of the cash book. Same rule again here, and it's going to swap sides, so it's now going to become a debit entry in the general ledger. We'll look at the total amount that was spent on wages, add this in, put in some details, and insert our date. And that closes the wager ledger for the month. Finally, we move on to sales. Looking at our cash book, sales are on the debit side. So that means that they must go into the ledger on the credit side. So we'll find our total figure, which is €12,000, and add this into the credit side of the ledger. We'll finish this off by adding in details and a date. So that's how you complete an analysed cashbook and post it to the general ledger. Here's what the completed parts look like. Your cashbook is recording transactions as they happen, and the ledger is a summary of all these transactions. I know it's a lot of work, but once you remember the basic principles here, that money received goes on the debit side and money paid out goes on the credit side. And once you get to the ledger, these simply swap places. If you can remember this, you won't go far wrong with a question like this. It can take quite a while to complete a question like this, but practice makes perfect, and once you get into the swing of things, it'll be no problem for you.